story as to how we came to be here today. I am from South Texas, born in Brownsville. So I'm very proud and happy that we have a delegation here from my hometown. Grew up in the city of Corpus Christi. Went to St. Mary's University, San Antonio.
Eso.
I lived for a little while in Houston, and now I've made my life here in Dallas. So in a little way, I touch all the cities, many of the cities that are here, not everybody. And I lived for 7 months in D.C. So what I want to share with you is some of the context of the individuals who have shaped me and helped shape our movement. I'm talking about people's named Larry Castillo, for example. He was my high school crush, my high school best friend, my first lover. Larry and I graduated high school together in 1976. He went to Trinity University and I went to St. Mary's in San Antonio. He left Trinity after about a year and a half because he wanted to go to the military, to the Air Force. He thought it would make a man of him. He thought it would drive out these gay feelings. It would be a way to basically mainstream himself and back into what his family expected of him. Where did they assign him? San Francisco, Monterrey. Had a great time. I was jealous for all that he did. I ended up back home in Corpus in 82, and in 83 he comes home. Larry comes home with this strange disease that we didn't know what it was. It was called, at that time, GRIDS. Gay-related immune deficiency syndrome. And those of us who were living at the time remember that we were faced with a situation where you had to make a decision if you were going to be in someone's life. Porque at that time they were saying, oh, it's poppers that's causing it. Man, big radical, everybody was using poppers. Next day, nobody wanted to use poppers. People still use them too, but anyway. Then they were saying, it's a virus. So, we didn't know what it was. Maybe it's a virus. Or maybe it's just something in the air. So if you breathe the same air that they're breathing, you're going to get sick too. Who knows what it is? So we had to make conscious decisions whether you were going to be involved in someone's life. And of course, I made the decision to be in his life. And supported him as best I could, and really kind of freaked out when I found out that he decided that his way out, before he had to tell his parents, because he was already showing symptoms and all that, he committed suicide in 1985. Now that was not an uncommon story. I wish it were, but it was not. Reached the point, even in the cities like Corpus, where we were burying, going to funerals at least once a month. Common story. Those of us who lived at the time, I'm not saying anything new. At that time, in Corpus, there was a bar. Lots of bars, but one in particular called the Hidden Door. It had become, at that time, it belonged to like a trust. The original owner had died, and he left it in like a foundation. And the manager there at that bar was a guy named Andy White. And Andy and Jerry Ortega, I'm purposely giving you these names of people who really made a difference. Jerry Ortega was always out in Twit. I remember the monthly magazines. He was doing also, he was an activist. And he and Andy got together. They called us up and they said, you have to come to the bar. Okay, why are we coming? Okay, maybe they're going to give us free drink. No, what they wanted to do was they were going to have us go, a task force, go from Corpus to Austin and San Antonio and Houston to find out what these cities were doing in response to the AIDS crisis in their town, to see what we can do in Corpus. So I was one of the 7 people that was tasked to go and do this. They gave us money. They gave us enough money for fuel for a car, and we had like 4 or 5 nights that we stayed at a hotel. There was 2 hotel rooms for 7 of us. And so we would go around, and then we ran out of money pretty quickly, so we started staying with friends that we knew. And we went into Austin, one of the better organized communities that we saw at the time, and we met with people who were then at that time called the Austin AIDS Foundation. They've changed their name since then. But they gave us a lot of information that we thought this would be great, how we could bring this response to our hometown of Corpus Christi. We piled into a station wagon and did that, traveled around Texas, went back to Corpus, and we were excited. They gave us ideas about how to start a nonprofit, do all that, and we did. We were originally going to call ourselves the Corpus Christi AIDS Foundation, but quickly realized that in the small towns around Corpus, there were already a lot of cases we knew about, so we called ourselves the Coastal Bend AIDS Foundation. Within 6 months, we were meeting at Spahn Hospital, large Catholic hospital in Corpus. We had donors, we had people that were coming in, and we had a board. We were nonprofit status. And then by the 7th month, those of us who were Latinx on that board were told, you know, you're kind of controversial, the Latinos. The peoples we're talking to, the Catholic hospital, they're having difficulty, you know, with y'all being up in the front. So we need y'all to take a step back and kind of not be that visible, because we need to have a professional presentation as to how we're going to do it, so that we can get the money and the resources to serve the community. And you know what? Because that was kind of the mindset at the time, we just accepted it and said, okay. All of this that we had set up, and you know, I go back and I look at the history of that organization. They've also changed their name now, but they were for a long time the Coastal Bend AIDS Foundation. And they don't talk at all about the history of those 7 people that went to Austin. All of us from the LGBT community, people like Jerry Ortega, Raul Sandoval, myself and others, that went to create this institution now in the Coastal Bend. We were written out. But that's not the only time that happens to us. We, throughout history, have been marginalized, even though in many ways we were the ones that really created the institutions that serve our communities. That was basically the mid to late 80s, 86, 87 in Corpus. Prior to that, I remember when I was growing up, hearing about a week-long series of articles that the hometown newspaper, the Corpus Christi Caller-Times, was going to share with the community about gayness in Corpus. And I was looking forward to it. I made up all sorts of reasons, excuses, why I had to have a research paper or something back home to go read. And so I read about all of the bars and all of how the police harass people and all that type of stuff. That was 70s Corpus. 80s Corpus, we were dealing with the AIDS crisis. I've already talked a little bit about that. And things were changing. We were starting to have pride festivals. We had Splash Day. I ended up being on the committee there, so that helped me learn how to fundraise and do some other things there. In the 90s, early 90s, we had a sad situation in my hometown in Corpus where we had a lot of youth that were being impacted by AIDS and HIV exposure. And we had a group of young people, some of them were Lulac youth members, who created a support group for themselves. And they had reserved room, space, at the La Retama Central Library in downtown Corpus Christi. Everything was going great, except that a city councilman in the city of Corpus found out about this and went on a crusade, an anti-LGBT. He blamed us for everything that could go wrong in Corpus and caused all this controversy, so that the next meeting time after he talked to these people, there was a mass of media out there waiting for the youth to find out who because he was saying that we, the gay community, were using city facilities to convert young, vulnerable people, non-LGBT individuals into gayness. And so the media was there to interview these people, these young people. So I went with a group of young people that were there to support it. We hadn't really heard about this support group. And we ended up with a guy from the MCC church, John Hack. If you know Dallas, I think he's an MCC pastor here in Dallas now. He ended up being a hero of the day in the sense that he ended up basically telling the media that if they interviewed or if they did anything with these minors, that the church would sue their stations, and he took all their interviews. But he also opened the door to his church and asked me to go with the group to help them formalize a better structure. We did that. We met basically twice a week. We had so many kids. We went from about 8 to 80 within a matter of weeks. And that group lasted for 2.5 years. One of the sad things that happened there is a story of a young man named, I'm going to call Freddie. That's not his real name, but I'll just call him Freddie. Freddie was living with his parents, was a student at Roy Miller High School in Corpus Christi. He was beat up by his father and kicked out of the house because he was gay. And Freddie decided that that life was not worth living, and he was going to commit suicide as well. He did that by taking a bunch of pills. Fortunately, he lived, but unfortunately, it really crashed his kidneys. He ended up in the psych ward at Memorial Medical Center. This is a big public hospital in Corpus. It's no longer there. It's part of Spahn Hospital, the Catholic hospital. But he was in the psych ward there. And I remember going in to visit him and him telling me that he was having to put up with, he didn't know how to respond to the psychiatric nurses that were telling him he deserved what he got.
Oh my God.
Because of the way he was thinking and feeling. That he needed to submit himself to conversion type therapy, and then God would have compassion on him and heal him and fix him. When I complained to the medical director told me, you know, we know what's best for the client. We know what's going to be, and you're just a master's level counselor. You know, we have doctors here that are working with these individuals. So just leave it alone. So at that point, I got very upset and angry, and decided that I needed to do something. But what I did is I ended up leaving Corpus because I was very frustrated with other things going on there, and moved here to Dallas to go pursue a doctorate degree in counseling, figuring that maybe I could have a voice if I had the doctorate. Maybe that's what I was listening to. I heard them say that. And I figured that I would go back to Corpus. What ended up happening is, as I came here to UNT and got very involved in the community here in North Texas, came to realize that many of the same problems that we were facing down there were going on here. And that we had to stop and make an impact. And the best thing about this community here is that there is a lot of great people like Jesse and so many others that I met here, that you had to support yourself. You're not isolated like you feel sometimes in the smaller cities like Corpus. So we ended up, I'm gonna fast forward to 2004 in San Antonio at the Lulac National Convention. Ended up a couple of nights in a row out at the clubs in San Antonio, and at the Silver Dollar in particular, we filled up the whole place. It was nothing but Lulacers. And we all looked at each other and we all said, hey, I mean, we're all kind of closeted in Lulac. Why aren't we more open? Why aren't we out? Why aren't we doing something? why don't we have LGBT Lulac councils? And we all said next year we'll come back out and open. Of course, next year was in Little Rock. Ooh. And we were there together having a good time, but it wasn't as friendly as San Antonio. So we had a good time, but we all again said next year. Next year was in Milwaukee. So we got together and here in Dallas, and we had a group called Valiente that would meet. It was a social group. I went to a Valiente meeting. They invited. I got myself invited to speak, and I talked about why we should join Lulac, why we needed to be part of this advocacy group. And they asked me, well, how open is the organization to LGBT issues? And I had to say, I don't know. This would be the first. So we got a group of people together, and I still have the original documents. By then, by the way, I had been elected in 2004 as the first openly gay state deputy for young adults. I was the first openly gay state officer in Lulac.
Good job.
Yeah, so that was an interesting time. But as a state officer, I was able to charter new councils. So I was able to work with our community here in Dallas to get our first group going. And the first group of people we spoke to, we had so much both fear and people saying that they couldn't participate, that our first interim officers were a young man who was president. His name was Corey, he was a white young man. He had been president of a Lulac Youth Council in Fort Worth. And he said, I've been a president of a council, it's a youth council, but I'll be president. Because nobody else wanted to be president. Nobody else wanted to be the person that had to stand up. And I couldn't be president because I was their organizing officer. I had to be the one chartering it. So he stepped up. And then we had a white female who was the vice president, because the Latinos in the group were somewhat fearful and didn't want to have to go out in public and stand and talk and represent. It took a lot of courage. And it wasn't until essentially almost a year later, because at the time Jesse was wanting to, but he was in Stonewall. But he was chair of Stonewall. So after about a little while, about almost a year, we talked Jesse into really doing, running for and allowing himself to be our district, our council president rather. Jesse Garcia. And he's the one that really brought the council to the prominence of the opportunities that we had. I really want to give him
we love you,
the kudos
Jesse.
he needs. And I'm going to basically close at this time with my personal sharing, just to say that when I get up in the morning, when I think about what we do, what keeps me going now that I'm over 60 years old, is remembering those individuals that I made a promise to. Individuals like Larry, I mentioned him, my first love. Individuals like Jerry Ortega, who really deserves a lot of recognition for the work he did, taking out cucumbers and condoms and going to schools and showing kids how to put them on appropriately. So many other things he did, founding organizations in my hometown in Corpus and other things. Raul and so many others, the voices that we've lost. When Letty got emotional here earlier, I mean, it really impacted me también, because we can't forget what happened at that time. And those of us who lived through that time know that for us, for many of us, when we think about the times, for example, when I think about Ronald Reagan, I cannot get past the fact in my heart to me, he was a murderer. A murderer because for 6 years of his 8-year administration, he refused to even speak the words gay or AIDS. It wasn't until C. Everett Koop was the Surgeon General, that he forced the issue on the administration. After a lot of advocacy, we had people here in Dallas that were doing die-ins and other things, not just Dallas, all over the country. But it took that type of activism to make things happen for us. And right now, we are once again in a time when it calls for us to be activists like that. Activists for ourselves, our community, and our brothers and sisters. I'm 8th generation at least Tejano, but we have a lot of brothers and sisters who are here from many countries of the world, not just Mexico and other countries to the south of us. And many of them come because they are fleeing the oppression that they've run into in their countries. And many of them deserve our compassion, and not just our compassion, but our willingness to work together and support, because there, but for the grace of God, go we. And have been our predecessors and ourselves. Thank you, and let me know.